we are back to Danny Pod. Today, we are going to talk about something that happened in December 2001, which had a global impact, and we don't hear a lot about it, or none about it. Our guest is Mr. Stewart Paterson. He wrote a book called China, Trade and Power. How are you, Mr. Paterson?
Very well, and thank you, Daniel, for having me on your podcast.
Thank you, it's an honor. Can you give us an introduction to where have you been around and why have you decided to write the book?
Sure. So I left the United Kingdom in 1994 and moved to India to work in finance. And from there, I moved to Hong Kong and spent the years between 1998, so just after the handover, till 2007, just before the global financial crisis, living in Hong Kong, working for Credit Suisse and Credit Lyonnais Securities in Asia. And then I moved to Singapore, where I ran my own hedge fund, and then moved back to the United Kingdom in 2012. What struck me about the political and economic discourse in the United Kingdom when I moved back from Asia in 2012 was what seemed to me to be a lack of understanding of how China's economic integration with the rest of the world and China's rise was responsible in no small part for a lot of the social and economic issues that the country was facing. And it occurred to me that I didn't think the United Kingdom was unique in this respect, and that there was a broad misunderstanding outside Asia of the influences that China was having on economic outcomes, the state of our democracies, and the growing disparities in wealth and income that were beginning to dominate the political agenda.
All right. Can you give us an introduction to the recent political history of China prior to entering the WTO?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, clearly, after the Second World War, China was embroiled in a civil war, which the communists won. And under Mao, really, the country went backwards, obviously. We had the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward. And then with the passing of Mao and as Deng Xiaoping took over the running of the country, it was clear that China had fallen far behind, and there were just these abject levels of poverty. And what Deng Xiaoping did was to embark upon a reform program, doing away with the worst elements of the Maoist economic planning. He started to change incentive structures in the country, initially in agriculture and then for local industries. As we went through the early 1980s and into the early 1990s, this reform momentum gathered a pace, and it was showing tremendous results. Obviously off a low base, it's very easy to grow your economy very fast. This, of course, led a lot of people to believe that China was on an inextricable path towards adopting what we consider to be fairly normal approach to economic management. Those reforms were very productive off a low base, as I say. But I think it's important to understand that even amongst the most committed reformers, there was very little ideological commitment to sort of free market economics. There was an appreciation that the Maoist system had failed and that incentive structures could provide a big fillip to growth and improve living standards. But there were very few in China who were embracing democracy, liberalism and pluralism, and saw economic reform as a way to engender those values. economic reform was seen much more as a useful way of delivering to the people and therefore legitimizing the monopoly of political power that the Communist Party enjoys.
Okay, so why wasn't China on the World Trade Organization? And what happened that made China a member in December 2001?
So in one of history's great ironies, China was in fact a founding member of GATT, the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs, which was the predecessor organization to the World Trade Organization. So it was one of the original signatories, but it was a different China. The Republic of China, what we more commonly refer to as Taiwan, withdrew from GATT in 1950. And so actually one of the issues at the start of the People's Republic of China's engagement with GATT to try and rejoin was whether it was actually a resumption of China's membership of GATT, which later became the WTO, or whether it was a new accession process. And it was decided that it was a new accession process. And so this was a long and drawn out affair, and for a number of reasons. Obviously, the negotiation took 15 years or so. The way the accession process works is that interested parties get to negotiate on a bilateral basis with the would-be joiner of the organization. Working parties are set up. And of course, the whole process was punctuated by events such as the Tiananmen Square massacre, which clearly set the Chinese agenda back. But also, membership required China to make very considerable and deep reforms to its economy. And within China, there were differing opinions as to the merits of this. State-owned enterprises provided employment for life, a huge sort of social safety net, what was known as the Iron Rice Bowl. So state-owned enterprises would own housing, would own hospitals, schools. So you were really part of a corporate community that was a cradle to grave social security network, if you like. And clearly, that system wasn't working, and access or exposure to the global economy had the potential to kill off through competition a lot of these state-owned enterprises. So the Chinese themselves blew hot and cold throughout the process. But the process sort of reached its climax in 1999-2000. And Zhu Rongji infused the process with new enthusiasm. The more liberal elements of the Communist Party at the time seemed to have the upper hand in terms of economic reform. Anyway, when I say liberal, I mean economically liberal. The bilateral negotiations with the United States were really the sort of turning point in terms of, the conclusion of that was really the turning point in terms of bringing China's accession process to fruition.
And can you say that path to the acceptance of the China in the World Trade Organization was made by Kissinger? And what were the arguments or the propaganda to let China in?
So obviously Kissinger was a key player in the original opening up of China, and Kissinger associates have represented various corporate interests. And it was the corporate lobby that brought pressure to bear to force through what was called permanent normal trade relations, which was a prerequisite for China's accession to WTO. Just to be clear, what we call most favored nation status, which is basically that if you grant a benefit to one country, you grant them to them all, is an underlying principle of the World Trade Organization. And under the sort of Jackson-Vanik Amendment to, I think it's the 1974 Trade Act in the United States, non-market economies could be subject to a sort of annual approval process or a waiver from the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. And clearly that was incompatible with WTO membership, because America couldn't retain the right to withhold MFN status if China was in the World Trade Organization, because part of the principle of World Trade Organization membership is that everyone gets it permanently. And so the debate in America about whether to grant China permanent normal trade relations was really the crucial part of the accession process. The approach from the sort of pro-China lobby or the pro-accession lobby was really to say, well, look, we have a tremendously imbalanced trade relationship anyway with China. We have very asymmetric market access agreements with China. They have access to the United States and we don't have access to China. And therefore, this is a no-brainer for the United States. If we bring them into the World Trade Organization, we get greater access to their market than we have already, whereas they don't really get anything from us. So that was the sort of economic side of their argument. The sort of more geopolitical side was to say, look, if China's 1.4 billion people, well, back then it was 1.2. If we want China to be a responsible member of the global community, we have to treat it as though it's going to be a responsible member. We have to bring them into these multilateral organizations. And in doing so, we can impose this framework on China. And fresh from the aftermath of the Cold War and the hubris perhaps that went with that, when people were talking about the end of history, it was assumed that given the choice, consumerism and neoliberal economics would triumph and that everyone would want to adopt it. It was just a matter of time. And that the only sort of obstacle on the horizon here was how were the Communist Party going to sort of wriggle out of their statist approach to things. Maybe democracy in the way we know it wouldn't come to fruition in China, but the path was predetermined, and China would reform, liberalize, civil society would thrive, and gradually the power of the state would diminish and the power of the individual would rise. And as China's middle class got more wealthy, they would demand a say in the government of the country. And so everything was going to go in the right direction, and there was nothing really that the hardliners in the party could do about it. So that was the pro argument. From the Western side, the resistance came from firstly organized labor. But if you think about it, in the early 2000s, organized labor wasn't in a very strong position politically. Inflation had been crushed by Paul Volcker. Globalization in a more moderate form seemed to be working relatively well, particularly for the developed countries. Unemployment was low, and the organized labor's voice was much diminished. Obviously, there were environmentalists and a sort of rainbow coalition of interest groups. But in comparison to the corporate lobby, the multinational lobby, these voices of resistance were very mute. And so the corporate lobby and the sort of optimistic interpretation of the way China was going won the day. Within China, there was also a division, though, because while the more reformist elements of the party thought that WTO membership would act as a catalyst for reform. It would help improve the efficiency of the economy. There were also reactionaries in China who actually believed the Western liberal line and thought, well, actually, this is all designed to undermine our authority. This is a challenge to our sovereignty. This is going to erode the power of the party. And so the reformers and the more reactionary elements of the Communist Party, I mean, in a way, this played into China's hands, because the liberals could say to the Western powers, look, if you don't do this, we're going to lose out to the hardliners. You know, the nationalists are going to win. And therefore, you've got to go easy on us if you want us to triumph. So, in a way, that argument, of course, contradicted the Western view that, or the predominant Western view, that there was only one way. The Chinese were actually arguing that there was another way, and therefore you better toe the line and be gentle on us, otherwise the hardliners will triumph. Anyway, it happened, and China came into the World Trade Organization, and obviously a lot of things have changed since.
And so they didn't become more liberal or democratic since then. And what happened to China after that, in economically and politically speaking?
Yeah, so economically, it was a boom for China. You know, in the year before China's accession to WTO, their exports totaled just $250 billion. You know, by 2007, that had grown fivefold to $1.25 trillion. I mean, that's a sort of compound annual growth rate of nearly 30%. So China's exports absolutely took off. And then there was obviously the interruption of the global financial crisis, and then they doubled again, sort of to $2.5 trillion by 2014. What was at work here was that WTO accession gave multinationals confidence that product coming out of China would find a market, that there was nothing other countries could do to particularly block those exports. There were, in fact, in the WTO accession agreement that China signed, plenty of potential safety valves. There was the potential for countervailing duties to compensate for state subsidies. There was the potential for governments to put in what was called anti-surge quotas. So if you know, textile exports grew too quickly, governments had the right to roll them back somewhat. But these were simply not used. So you have to be careful about who we blame for this, because you know, Western governments didn't use a lot of the tools that were at their disposal to resist this export surge from China. And the multinational lobby basically made out very well out of this, because clearly, you know, China entered the World Trade Organization with a wage level of about 1/30 of developed market wage levels. FDI into China tripled in the decade after WTO accession vis-a-vis before WTO accession. So what was at work here was basically the biggest labor arbitrage in history, where Western multinationals could close down factories in the expensive markets and move them to China. And China did everything in its power to help facilitate this, as one would, right? You know, so free land for factories, preferential tax treatment in export zones, exemption from import duties for stuff that was being processed and then re-exported again, long corporate profit tax holidays, you know, financing, you know, trade financing. And then for domestic companies, similar preferential treatment, you know, VAT exemptions for exports and what have you, special economic zones. And of course, from that, China built a massive trade infrastructure. So its shipping lines expanded, stevedorage, ports, railroads and road networks to get to the port from the industrial zones. And so exports were the key driver of China's economic ascent, really from 2001 through to the global financial crisis, and even to some extent after that. China's current account surplus peaked at 10% of GDP. And most of the imports that were coming into China were simply imports for reprocessing. So it might have been ores or oil for energy to support the industrial base, or components. But really it was all about exports. So it was tremendous for China. In the West, not so. Clearly one expects manufacturing as a percentage of GDP to decline as GDP grows because services become more important. But what happened was there was a massive acceleration in the deindustrialization of the more expensive economies, and also of emerging economies that were building critical mass in manufacturing. So, manufacturing wages in Mexico really haven't grown in dollar terms since China came into the World Trade Organization. So Mexico had been, in a way, the preferred outsourcing destination prior to China's rise, and it lost out tremendously to China. Now, obviously, one can't blame the Chinese for pursuing these policies. These were very much in their own national interest, but it was done in a way with the acquiescence of Western policymakers, and in a way at the direction of our own multinationals, in a way that really no one could do anything about, that's the wrong expression. It was done in a way that was unfair within the spirit of the policy of the way market economies work, and arguably also in many ways against the letter of the law as well. What I mean by that is, there was a lot of IP theft, intellectual property theft. There was clear just corporate espionage going on. In addition to all the state subsidies, the Chinese economy's structure is such that the state really controls everything. And that was true then, and it's true now. Now, of course, that's not to deny that there is a very vibrant and large private sector. But savings in China tend to flow through the banking system. The banking system monopolizes the savings flow. The savings obviously are huge. And the banking system, which is state-owned, allocates that capital. And so the commanding heights of China's economy remain controlled by the state. Not only do you have state-owned industries dominating things like the airlines, the shipping industry, the shipbuilding industry, telecommunications, the oil and gas industry, major infrastructure and construction. You also obviously have, because the state controls the allocation of capital, they direct the course of the economy, and that is done through the planning process. And so what China's accession to WTO brought about was this clash of economic systems. I'm not talking here about the value and the political systems, but a clash of economic systems. On one extreme, you had the market economies of the United States, and the sort of mixed economies on a spectrum moving away from that to this statist, centrally planned sort of state capitalism. And the two don't mix well, because the whole point of trade is to lead to a more efficient allocation of resources by the discovery of comparative advantage. And in doing that, one expands the overall pie, right, through the efficient allocation of resources. But what state capitalism does is allocate resources not according to a pattern of comparative advantage, but according to a pattern determined by the state's goals for the economy. And so the steel industry is a good example of an industry in which China has no comparative advantage and yet makes half the steel in the world. And so that was
Brazil
in my
suffered a lot with that because we were a huge exporter to them. And since they built a lot of plants there, we don't have that advantage anymore.
That's right, and the state, the steel industry in China received huge subsidies in order to take that industry away. So there were a number of mistakes. I mean, the major one, though, really, in my view, that we could have done something about and didn't. We didn't utilize the provisions of WTO properly, but then WTO wasn't set up to handle a sort of mercantilist, state capitalist country in its midst. And the other thing we didn't insist on was a floating exchange rate. Because, of course, if these huge current account surpluses had taken place in a market-driven exchange rate environment, the RMB would have appreciated very substantially, and that would have eroded China's cost advantage, and we would have had a much smoother transition. But because China was able to maintain a fixed exchange rate at a chronically undervalued level through foreign exchange intervention, remember, foreign exchange reserves in China went from a very low level of 100 billion or so to $4 trillion at their peak in 2015, and that is the measure of the degree to which China was intervening in exchange rate to maintain export competitiveness. But it's not the only measure, because all those mercantilist policies aimed at repressing demand for imports, such as heavy consumption taxes, for example, and all those policies aimed at encouraging exports also have an impact on a sort of a real effective exchange rate. And we did nothing about it.
Well, it's a different approach than what the US had with Japan, when Japan was wiping out some areas in the US in the industry, and the US talked to Japan and said, "Come on, we need to put a cap on our exports here from you. So I'm going to import here from you." So it's a totally different approach. Besides the corporate America that benefited from that, can't we say that the consumers benefited in the West?
Yes and no. And the overriding answer, I think, is no. So the way in which they did benefit was that the price of tradable goods fell, and in many cases plummeted. So cheap televisions, mobile phones, back in the day, going back 10 years, it was more sort of toys and clothes. These all became cheap. And in that sense, the consumer benefited, and by buying cheap stuff from China, that obviously freed up disposable income, assuming income remained the same, to spend on other things. The problem with that argument, I see, is that all those trade models that demonstrate how consumer welfare improves as a result of trade like that assume full employment. And of course, what was happening was that people were losing their jobs in manufacturing, well-paid jobs, and if they were finding employment, it was in service industries with jobs that weren't paying the same wages and weren't as productive. And so that idle resources argument takes away a lot of the benefit from the free trade. But the other issue here was that the downward pressure on prices that was coming from China making stuff cheaper had to be resisted by the Federal Reserve. And the reason for that was the Federal Reserve, Bernanke was a student of the Great Depression and the impact of deflation on the economy. And his view was that deflation would not be allowed to happen in the United States. Well, by signing up to China coming into WTO, they were creating a very disinflationary environment. You were bringing a workforce at the time of 600 million people into the global trading system at a 30th of America's costs. And that workforce we knew was going to grow to about 1 billion over the subsequent 20 years. So that was always going to be incredibly deflationary. The result was, of course, the United States had to slash interest rates much more aggressively in previous cycles. That created the TMT bubble, or was one of the factors creating the TMT bubble, which obviously, the bursting of which, occurred as China came into WTO and shortly afterwards, and reflating from that, obviously interest rates had to go to unprecedented levels. China's recycling of its current account surpluses into US treasuries suppressed the cost of borrowing in the United States that helped inflate the housing bubble, the bursting of which obviously gave rise to the global financial crisis. Now, we can't blame all that on China. There were other factors at work there: greed, corporate malfeasance, and all the rest of it. But the macroeconomic backdrop that allowed it to happen was a function of economic engagement with China and their mercantilist approach to suppressing their own exchange rate by recycling the current account surpluses into US treasuries and suppressing interest rates. So and then of course we had to have quantitative easing to get out of it as well. And so from a consumer's perspective, we've had massive inflation in non-tradables and assets, which makes life very expensive. So let me elaborate. I mean, obviously we can all see how rising real housing prices erode middle-class well-being. You have to pay a larger multiple of your salary for a house, and salaries obviously for Main Street, for people in normal employment outside of financial services, have been capped by competition with China. So median incomes in the United States have hardly grown at all over the 20 years since China came into WTO, which is a perfectly predictable market result of trading with people who at the starting point were earning 1/30th of what you were earning. But house prices have gone up and non-tradables have gone up, the things that couldn't be exchanged with China at a fraction of the price. So the price of education, the price of healthcare services. So the things that really matter in life, the house, the college that your kids go to, the healthcare that you get, all these things have been inflated by Federal Reserve monetary policy aimed at staving off overall price deflation. Whereas the cost of stuff that is every day, but at the end of it quite inconsequential, like a television or a mobile phone, has plummeted. What's the point of a cheap washing machine if you don't have a house in which to put it? So it's a long answer to whether consumers have benefited or not. And it's not nearly as simple, I don't think, as just saying, well, they got to buy cheap stuff, so yes, they benefited. It's not that simple at all.
Have you seen a movie? It was a book turned to a movie called Hillbilly Elegy, which is on Netflix. And it's about the story of a small town in Midwest America that had an industry there that was taken down. And it shows that after a couple of years, or 20 years after, 10 years after that, the desperate situation of that city, the violence, drugs, alcoholism, and it kind of shows, I believe, what happens to the labor voters that turn from Labour to Conservatives in the UK, and from Democrats to Republicans, and voted Trump, voted Brexit. I think do you think that's one of the major reasons that shift occur?
Yes, very much so. I think very much so. I mean, what that Trump vote was about was the disillusionment with mainstream politicians and the influence that the corporate lobby had exerted over the establishment, whether they were Republican or Democrat. Now, I mean, one of the most remarkable things about China's accession to WTO, it actually happened under Bush, but all the preamble had happened under Clinton. It was a done deal by the time Bush became president. it was during Clinton's second term, and you know, he had stood on an election promise to be hard on China, that progress would be linked to human rights, and you know, he was demonstrating empathy and concern with the blue collar worker. And it took, you know, 18 months of corporate lobbying to turn him on a dime to supporting China's unconditional accession to WTO. I say unconditional because once they were into WTO, you know, the framework in WTO, even though theoretically there were things that people could have done to limit the impact, in practice the organization was not set up to handle that kind of engagement with state capitalism. So it's no wonder, I mean, it's taken time for that to sink in and for the damage to be done. But in my view, a lot of the Trump vote was about that. And interestingly, I mean, Biden has been elected really by the same blue collar vote that voted for Trump. And so, of course, there are Wall Street backers for Biden, but it's really the blue collar vote that got him where he is. And so I don't see a change of strategy really from the United States with regards to economic engagement with China. I see a change of tone and a more conventional approach to policy formation. And there is certainly a sense that although I think viscerally Trump understood what had happened and what needed to be done, the rather transactional and ad hoc approach to policy formation maybe wasn't that helpful. I think he was so successful in moving the middle ground in terms of what the West's engagement with China ought to be.
But the tariffs that he was imposing were working, right?
Well, so it depends how you define working. I think in terms of the tariffs themselves, the first round were fairly carefully calibrated and got the attention of the Chinese policymakers. The deal, I don't think was really tenable. You know, preferential treatment, buying this quota, buying that quota, that's transactional. It doesn't get to the root of the problem. The root of the problem is that when you engage with a statist, mercantilist economy, your own free market principles kind of have to go out of the window because they're going to end up changing you through subsidizing their own industries, and they will, in effect, allocate capital in your own economy by allocating capital in their own. You know, if they decide they're going to dominate the steel industry, you have no choice but to let that go or play the same game that they play and throw subsidies at it, right? So they end up determining the shape of your own economy. And I think, you know, the transactional approach, so the tariffs, I think, were working up to a point. You know, they had an asymmetric impact on China relative to the United States. So that was good. And it got their attention, and it showed that they it put them under a lot of pressure. And you know, I would argue the Chinese economy has not been growing for the last couple of years in the way the official data shows. That the pain from those tariffs and the knock-on effect has actually been really quite substantial. I mean, there are other factors at work there as well. But I think what Biden brings to the table now is an ability to make alliances, to bring other people in on this, and to present a more united front to China. I think one of the mistakes Trump made was to try and address all the perceived ills and economic crimes, if you want, that he perceived America had suffered from, to try and address them all at the same time. And that was never going to work. You know, China is a big economy. They're masterful in their economic diplomacy. They are very good at dividing and ruling. And, you know, we saw this in the run up to WTO session and beyond, you know, that they play Airbus off against Boeing. They play the EU off against the United States. Yeah. They play Japan off against Korea. You know, they are very good at engineering splits. And of course, their job was made very easy by Trump. I think it'll be harder for them under Biden. So Trump's legacy is that he changed the agenda and changed the perception of China in the public's view, in my opinion. Biden's potential legacy is that he sees this through with a successful sort of all-encompassing economic strategy. But the jury's still out on that, obviously.
Oh, good. In dealing with China, can we say free trade is good? Can we compete with China?
It's very hard to see how that's going to work, because China has to make some fundamental changes to the structure of its economy to make it a market economy. So, you know, free trade is good where it leads to a more efficient allocation of resources. You know, that's where the benefit comes from. But to do that, you need a market-driven way of allocating resources. And China's system of 5-year plans, China's system of state ownership of banks, and the control of the allocation of capital mean that China is not allocating resources, economic resources, along market lines. And whereas in the past, there have been other countries that have done this, they've never done it on the scale that China has done it. This was the issue. I mean, to me, the big difference between Japan that you alluded to earlier and America, and the engagement with China, there are very many differences. But, you know, firstly, the scale was different. Secondly, Japan was under America's security umbrella and was a security ally. And thirdly, you know, in the case of China in the early days, it was American multinationals, you know, that were exploiting the cheap labor and exporting back into the United States. It's slightly different now, because obviously it's Chinese state-owned enterprises that are going out trying to dominate markets in third countries and what have you. But that wasn't the case in the early years post WTO. And so there are big differences. So I don't see, and I've thought about it long and hard, I don't see a way in which market economies engage with non-market economies successfully without sacrificing the efficiency of their own resource allocation. And, you know, we look at the prosperity that markets have generated in the West, the standard of living. We can argue about the inequality, absolutely, and I would argue a lot of that is down to this sort of quantitative easing and what have you. But as well as other factors like the oligopolization of industries and what have you, and the way that capital has been able to take a larger share from labor, of which engagement with China is part and parcel of that story. But, you know, we do not want to lose what is our greatest strength, which is these economies that consistently deliver per capita incomes multiple times that of the planned economies. And my worry is that engagement with China is leading us down a path where we end up losing that.
Yes, we didn't engage with the Soviet Union. So we are engaging with China. We are financing them, which is it's a completely strange thing to happen if you think about it.
Yeah. So when we get into the geopolitics, obviously it becomes more troublesome. You know, what we're seeing, and we've seen in the last year or so, has been a concerted attempt by China to liberalize its own capital markets, to hold out the prospect of tremendous profits for Wall Street companies and investors in China, in exactly the same way as they held out the prospect of great profits for industrial companies coming into China 20 years ago. And that produces another constituency in the West who are financially incentivized to lobby for China in the legislatures of the democracies. And, we saw this in the Trump administration with the bifurcation between, say, Pompeo and Navarro on the one hand, and Mnuchin and Cohen on the other hand. The corporate lobby were not pro-China, but pro-economic engagement, and arguing that we can in some way divorce our economic activities with China from our national security concerns and our sort of human rights concerns. But where you're dealing with an economy where the Communist Party have their tentacles in every element of economic activity and are planning the whole structure of the economy, I think that becomes very difficult. And as China's capital stock has grown, as China's economy has capital deepened and returns on capital have fallen, you're seeing the party now needing to shuffle the economic profits around in a way to prop up the financial system. And so, again, market-driven analysis is not going to serve people well, looking at the China economy and looking at investments in China. So, I've been arguing for the last couple of years that reluctantly, my view is that we need to begin a process of decoupling. We want it to be as painless as possible. But the solution to our problems is not to plunge deeper into China. Trump through the tariffs has reduced the trade volumes and values between them. It's not impacted the trade deficit particularly, but it's impacted the degree of dependence on China. What we do not want now is for our financial systems to become too intertwined, because that too is potentially weaponizable. And what we are dealing with is an authoritarian, totalitarian state that weaponizes economic engagement, and therefore the less of it we have, the better, in my view.
Yeah, thinking on a strategic point of view, we felt during COVID that when we needed supply, most of the supplies we needed were in China, and everybody was desperate. So maybe we should think about disengaging at least some parts of it from China, maybe.
So this has been an ongoing debate in the last couple of years, but it's amazing how slow people have been to wake up to the way that China's growth in manufacturing has given it monopolistic power over supply chains. And this is very similar to the sort of economic policies that Germany followed in the 1930s, for example, vis-a-vis smaller countries in Europe. But this rise in manufacturing, I mean, at the time of WTO accession, China had about a 6% share of global manufacturing, and it's now about 25%. So if China was a company, you'd have the antitrust people on them saying, well, hold on, you're getting monopolistic power. Obviously, in certain industries is much higher than that. Try buying a computer or a mobile phone that hasn't been through China at some point, and it's very hard to do. And even if China were the most benign country in the world, it still wouldn't be healthy from an economic perspective to have had that degree of concentration of manufacturing. So this is, there's a geopolitical dimension to this, but just primarily on from an economic perspective, you need diversification, and that is being slow coming about. But even the degree to which, and this is unbelievable, but the degree to which the Pentagon and the US military are dependent on components from China is extraordinary. China's grip on the rare earths industry has been allowed to happen and then been allowed to remain in place unchallenged. What it's indicative has been the naivety of policymakers in believing that these things all just sort themselves out at the end of the day, and that there is no sort of geopolitical leverage to be had from monopolizing these. And obviously what we found out the hard way, and it's been going on for decades. I mean, you know, the Japanese found this out in 2010 with a rare earth embargo, or the threat of it, and you know, so we've had plenty of warning, and in many ways I think it's shameful that we are still having this discussion in 2020, you know, when you know, China, like other people, they're not unique in weaponizing their economic, you know, their economic engagements and their linkages with other people, using those for geopolitical purposes. They're not unique in that. They're masterful at it. They're very quick to use it. And what's going on now in terms of H&M and Adidas and Nike, and, you know, we've seen this with the NBA recently, and anyone else who, you know, Norwegian salmon farmers, Taiwanese cat fishermen, Taiwanese pineapple growers. I mean, you know, if you are dependent on China as a market, you are incredibly vulnerable to influence operations and geopolitical arm twisting. And of course, the Australians epitomize this more than anyone at the moment. And therefore, you know, we've made our bed, and we're lying it, and now we've got to start reconstructing global supply chains and diversifying them away from China.
And there is only a small amount of companies that really make profit out of China, or the profit is really, really small comparing to the whole, is it?
Yeah, so in a way, this is the tragedy of the whole thing, I think, is that, you know, the Bureau of Economic Analysis in the United States produce data on multinational enterprise activity, and they break it down by country. You know, if you look at the amount of money that American multinationals report that they make in China, you know, the profit number is about 30 billion in a year. You know, it sounds like a lot, but, you know, corporate profits in the United States pre-pandemic were $2 trillion. You know, whether you look at sales, value added, or profits, what comes out of it is that of the overseas portion of multinationals, American multinationals activities, China counts for about 6 to 8% of the overseas portion. But obviously for a few companies, they make a lot of money and they shout hard about it. I mean, I'm in the process of looking at this from a European perspective at the moment with regards to the comprehensive agreement on investment that the EU and China have negotiated that needs ratifying by the European Parliament. And when you look at the amounts of money, you know, I mean, EU exports to China are A, asymmetric, they run a big deficit. B, it's dominated by Germany. You know, of the 27 countries in the EU, Germany accounts for nearly half the exports. The German car manufacturers obviously have, China is a big export market, but the majority of the German car sales are made in China for the China market. So, you know, Volkswagen have biggest, you know, manufacturing facilities in China. In aggregate, I think German car makers make more cars in China than they do in Germany. I mean, I think 2019 was the first time that happened. But, you know, Volkswagen's operating profits out of China, let's forget 2020 because of the pandemic, but in 2019, they made 4 billion euros, operating profits of about, I think it's 4.4 billion euros. 4 years before that, you know, they were making 6 billion euros. So not only are the profits small, the profits have been shrinking while China supposedly has been growing very rapidly. And I just think it's wrong that a small number of multinationals are trying to dictate the economic bloc in the EU's case, or in America's case, the nation's national interest or policy regarding the national interest, because they do not represent the national interest. They're a sectional interest, and a very small sectional interest at that, because, as I was saying, the overall numbers show that that China does not dominate the sort of corporate profits outlook for multinationals. if you look around the world, there is a block of about 35 countries that in combination have a population twice as large as China's, that is growing either as fast or faster than China is over the last 5 years. That block includes some pretty unsavory places, Myanmar being one, but we have India in there, which obviously accounts for a big part of that block. But you have places like Vietnam and Ethiopia and Tanzania and Kenya and so as we look into the future, and what we have to be doing in sort of trade policy and our foreign policy now is not looking in the rearview mirror, but looking 20 years out and saying, where is the growth going to come from? Where do we need to be making sure that we can engage with these countries on a fair basis? And putting in place the legislative infrastructure to do that. And as we redistribute supply chains out of China to make sure that we are encouraging, some struggling democracies and using that economic power to help cultivate value systems that we share.
Stewart, you mentioned you lived in Hong Kong. What is happening there? Have we lost Hong Kong?
Yes, I think we have. The issue, obviously, is that the handover of 1997 was done with the basic law in place and this 50-year agreement. But Hong Kong is part of China, and it's, I think what has rattled the Chinese, the communist Chinese, has been this pro-democracy and pro-independence movement in Hong Kong. And China is determined to stamp that out because what it sees is a problem there that if it doesn't act harshly with, will only get worse. And unfortunately, what that means is that this new security law is so broad and open. I mean, it's typical Communist Party law. You could interpret it to make anything you want happen, basically. So no one knows really if you're on the wrong side of the law until it's too late. And anything could be interpreted as a breach of that. I mean, I certainly wouldn't have this conversation with you now if I was based in Hong Kong, because most things I've said, some of the things I've said certainly could be construed as against China's national interest and, eroding the authority of the state. So financial services and the other sort of corporate services that Hong Kong thrives on rely on argument. They rely on free flow of information, accurate information, not propaganda. Markets require information. That's how prices are set. Buyers and sellers reacting to accurate, timely information. And you don't get accurate, timely information in China. And as the environment for journalists deteriorates, we've seen the BBC's senior correspondent just this week has fled Beijing to Taiwan and continued to be the China correspondent from Taiwan. We've seen a number of journalists expelled from China. But more important than the expulsions in a way is just what those left behind. What field do they operate in? What latitude do they actually have to tell the truth, investigate, to find the truth? And the answer is basically none. And so we're not, Hong Kong, I don't think can thrive with that kind of environment, and clearly. Hong Kong is going to rapidly, in my view anyway, converge and just become like any other mainland city. There's very little that marks Hong Kong out as being a special administrative region anymore.
Oh, that's a pity. Do you think our politicians, universities, and mainstream media are being influenced by Chinese policy? We just received this week news that the Chinese bank or government, something like that, gave money to one of our biggest unions here, and that they were buying propaganda or sponsoring some news TV channels here. They are getting really powerful down here also.
Yeah, so this has been ongoing for a long time. I think, in my view, the Australians were the first really to wake up to it and to start analysing it properly. So the Chinese Communist Party have an organisation called the United Front. What it is all about is influence and penetration, and it involves recruiting anyone really who is prepared to do their work for them, to influence civil society, to portray a positive image of the Communist Party, and at its more pernicious to ensure that only stories that are favourable see the light of day. And the Confucius Institutes in universities are a part of this. Yes, China tries to influence everyone that it possibly can. The good news is that we're waking up to it. But, you know, really, that's only been happening in the last 2-3 years that we've really scrutinized this. You know, and it's very hard sometimes to identify what is pernicious and wicked and what is not. You know, so you know, taking university lecturers and researchers, for example, and during their holidays, paying them handsomely to go and teach in Chinese universities and maybe pass on some of their research findings. If you're a university professor, that's a wonderful way to see a bit of China and earn some extra money. But what you're potentially doing, of course, is selling out your hard-earned intellectual property very cheaply and potentially to the detriment of your country. You know, lobbying by companies. You know, Wall Street has long been incentivized through you know, big IPO fees and advisory fees for state-owned enterprises to encourage China-friendly policy. And so there is a growing literature and a growing level of documentation of these influence attempts, and a growing list of people who have feathered their own financial nest, potentially at the expense of their own country's interests. Thankfully, I think we're starting to get on top of it now.
Yes, we are here in Brazil privatizing a lot of, for example, public companies in this energy sector, and China companies are buying it. So if you think about it, we are not privatizing. We are just selling to the Communist Party in China. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but we are in this mess right now. One last question. I'm going to talk a little bit about the economic history of Brazil since 1970. In the 1970s here, we had what was called the Brazilian miracle. We had a growth which was almost the same as in China right now. But then afterwards, we had in the 80s and in the beginning of the 90s, a collapse and a hyperinflation here in Brazil. In the mid-90s, we had the monetary change of policy change that brought inflation down. And from the beginning of the 2000s, the commodity boom really helped Brazil grow, but not our industrial park. So our industrial park, due to the accession of China to the World Trade Organization, was badly hit. right now we are seeing all the governments around the world with huge stimulus packages. Is inflation coming? Do you think the dollar will collapse or something like that? Will be changed by, will we go back to the gold standard? Is Bitcoin going to do something for us? Is China currency will dominate? What next?
Yeah, so I think, I caveat this that I'm not an expert in Brazil's economy, but to me, the optimistic side for Brazil is that you have in the world, this huge swathe of the world, 2.5 billion people in India and other emerging countries with low incomes, in India 3,000 per head, but in sub-Saharan Africa at about the $1,000 a head mark. And these countries are growing fast, and they will be reaching a point where they start to take off, hopefully, in the same way that China did in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so as these countries industrialized, I believe the demand for commodities will rise, and that there will be another sort of commodity super cycle driven by real demand from real people getting wealthier and seeking to reap the material benefits of that progress. So that's a positive. I actually am pretty bullish on the dollar. I think that I don't think that the RMB will in any way replace the dollar as a global reserve currency. A global reserve currency is not just about military power or who you trade with the greatest. You have to have some faith in the regime and the value system that it represents. And of course, there are a few countries in the world like Iran and North Korea and Venezuela and maybe Cuba and maybe Russia who would welcome the RMB as a counterweight to the dollar. But I don't really trust those regimes with my wealth, and I don't think many other people will either. Now, of course, you could argue, well, the Americans seem to be doing their best to devalue the dollar with the sort of fiscal profligacy, and we've had negative real interest rates for the best part of 20 years in terms of policy rates anyway. And that's true, but, at the end of the day, what's the alternative? I think that your point about Bitcoin, to my mind, and again, this is an amateur's view, central banks, the power of the state to issue currency, it's seigniorage. It's what the state has always been about. And the state does not want to lose seigniorage. And central banks will do everything in their power to make private sector cryptocurrencies fail. Now, you can argue whether they have the power to make it fail, but I can bet you that they will try. They do not want an alternative medium of exchange out there. Digital central bank currency is different, but private sector cryptocurrencies, I don't think central banks and governments want them around. So I think it's more of the same in terms of the sort of international monetary structure. I think the dollar remains the reserve currency. In terms of inflation, I can see where you're coming from, and eventually I think we'll get it. But my fear is that there are a couple more big deflationary shocks to come. One of them might well be out of China, with a large RMB devaluation at some point in the not too distant future, largely driven by loss of confidence in the regime, as it becomes evident that the Chinese economy is sort of going ex-growth. And with the potential for regime change there, because Xi Jinping, is not popular amongst huge swathes of the Chinese elite. I think there are big risks out of China, which would be very deflationary. Having said that, clearly what's going on in terms of money printing and the very optimistic sort of outlook for growth for huge swathes of the world's population as they absorb technology and make progress, that could well be very inflationary. So I'm relatively relaxed about the outlook for inflation at the moment, but looking forward, there is inflation down the road. And to be honest, governments need the inflation. We're not going to get rid of this. We're not going to pay this debt off. So what I see is a battle that central banks are trying to generate inflation. Governments want them to generate inflation, but events keep happening and stop it materializing. And the danger is, of course, that when it does take off, if it gets out of control, then we face another period like the early 1980s that, as you rightly point out, was a disaster for Latin America, where it gave back all the gains from the 70s because US interest rates went sky high, the dollar strengthened, and all this external debt came home to roost. So my advice is borrow your own currency, don't borrow America's.
Okay. Well, Mr. Paterson, thank you very much. It was an honor to have you here, and I hope you can come back. And we'll have your links on our podcast for people to find you if you want. And please buy his book, which is great, marvelous. And you can understand a lot of what's happening right now in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danny. Brilliant. Thank you very much for having me.